Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Ravenswood County. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Let's begin. In the autumn of 1887, at the remote Ravenswood Abbey, perched on a windswept ridge above the town of Coldwater, the sky was slate grey and the wind carried an edge of chill when the sisters arrived. Reverend Sister Imelda Hartwell led the small community of nuns, 6 in all, into the large stone abbey, formerly the seat of the Benedictine order. The place had sat for decades near the edge of Ravenswood Forest, its leaded glass windows glinting in the last rays of day. The property had been built in 1854 by the wealthy Lord Harrington as a retreat for his extended family, later converted into a monastic house when he died in 1865, and gifted the estate to the church. Locals whispered that Harrington had suffered strange losses, that something in the timber-lined basement had always unsettled the staff. Sister Imelda and her companions took up residence in the East Wing. The wing reputedly built atop the earlier Harrington cellar, which had been sealed off. County records of Coldwater show a small fire in 1878 in that cellar. Described as undetermined origin, smouldering embers found beneath old joists. At the time, the monastic order that would come to occupy the estate was the Order of St. Clara, a cloistered group who practiced strict silence during hours of daylight and kept detailed journals of every visitor and sacramental event. On the first evening, as dusk gathered, Sister Imelda walked the length of the cloister corridor, her lantern flickering, listening to the still hush of the forest beyond. The abbey had an austere quality, soaring arches, hushed stone steps, and the faint smell of damp timber. Immediately, a few of the sisters remarked on the odd echoes in the chapel when no service had recently been held. "One hears steps where none should be," Sister Agnes noted in her diary on 19th October 1887. It was a minor detail, easily overlooked, but it bore the weight of foreshadowing. The community's aim was simple: to live a life of prayer, care for the poor nearby, and maintain the Abbey's traditions of hospitality to pilgrims. They committed to the rule of devotion, austerity, and the silent hour after dusk. Yet already the documents show a subtle tension. The local townsfolk of Coldwater regarded the Abbey with a mixture of reverence and wariness. A newspaper clipping from the Coldwater Chronicle, dated November 1887, described how several farmhands passing late along the ridge claimed to hear chanting when all lights in the building were extinguished. The article dismissed it as poor nerves, but the mention stayed on file. Early on, Sister Imelda requested the parish council supply fresh iron grates for the furnace, citing odd smoke backdrafts in the basement during the first few nights. The council dismissed the request as excess caution, so the furnace remained unchanged. By mid-December, the sisters marked the passing of their first Advent at the Abbey. With winter settling in, the forest beyond swallowed the daylight earlier, and snow began to rim the paths leading up the ridge. The journaling sisters recorded the creak of trees, the distant howl of wind, and the solitude of their position. Yet what seemed at first a calm, pious routine would ripen into something darker, something that drew faint parallels to historical precedents where monastic houses met violent fates, such as those involving saints like Abbey the Younger, whose convent was set ablaze by invaders. The memory of that earlier case floated through the margin of ecclesiastical records as a caution, though the sisters of Ravenswood seemed resolutely unaware. In those first weeks, the Abbey also began to receive visitors, pilgrims from nearby towns, the curious, and occasionally a former apprentice of the Harrington estate seeking something of the past. Sister Imelda welcomed each quietly, offering lodging in one of the spare cells, asking only that guests maintain silence after Vespers. One such visitor, Mr. Arthur Finch, a young surveyor from Coldwater, left a brief complaint in the ledger. "The chill in the lower hall is unaccountable, and one feels watched. His entry, unsigned, remains among the minutes of the Abbey's guest book." And so the scene is set. A secluded abbey in the late 1880s, cloistered nuns, an old cellar with a sealed past, an attentive but uneasy local population, and a hush of things unsaid. The first stirrings of the unusual were quietly noted, but no alarm raised. The sisters intended only prayer, tradition, and service. Yet what was coming would test all of that. Through the early weeks of 1888, snow layered the roofs of Ravenswood Abbey like a shroud. The sisters carried on their daily observances, prayer at dawn, maintenance of the kitchen gardens, and transcription of psalms into worn ledgers. Yet even in those routines, the records begin to show fissures. In a parish report preserved at Coldwater Hall, the clerk noted, "The sisters of Ravenswood appear fatigued, pale, and withdrawn. Their confessor claims long vigils are taking their toll." What no official document could capture was the slow invasion of unease. Sister Agnes, whose diary is one of the few surviving from that period, described whispers at the edge of the cloister when no one stood near. Sister Margaret, responsible for maintaining the furnace, wrote that the ash from the lower grate grew thick and black as tar though the fire burned clean. These were the small signs that ordinary life was bending toward something unaccountable. By February, 2 farmhands from the town claimed they saw smoke curling from the Abbey chimney at hours when the nuns should have been asleep. One even swore he heard hymns carried over the snow. Their story found its way into the Coldwater Chronicle, and the editor inserted a short historical note comparing the account to an older record of the Abbey of Coldingham, where Ebba the Younger had once led a community that perished in flames centuries earlier. It was meant only as colour for the column, yet that coincidence later drew scholars' attention when the Ravenswood case resurfaced. Inside the Abbey, discipline grew harsher. Sister Imelda insisted on penance fasts and ordered the choir loft sealed after a cracked beam was discovered. The woodworkers from town who came to repair it reported an odor of smoke that no inspection could explain. The scent was not of burning timber. One man, Thomas Vale, later told an inquest, but of oil or pitch, as though something had seeped long into the stones. That spring, a visiting chaplain, Father Redmond, spent a night in the guest cell. His surviving note to the parish board reads, "I heard chanting after matins, low and rhythmic, from beneath the nave. When I asked the sisters, they swore no such prayers were kept at that hour." He recommended a structural survey, suggesting the sound might have carried through old venting shafts leading to the cellar. No survey ever took place. By midsummer, fatigue set in. Gardens withered from neglect. Correspondence to the bishop slowed. The sisters had ceased to appear at market or mass in town. Villagers began leaving provisions at the bottom of the ridge rather than climbing to the gate. "It was as if the place belonged to itself," one farmer's wife later said. Within those months, a peculiar ritual seems to have formed inside the walls. Ash piles were found near the chapel steps, arranged in deliberate rings. When asked, Sister Imelda replied that it was a purification custom borrowed from older convent traditions. Yet no such practice is recorded in Benedictine or Clarist liturgy. By late autumn of 1888, an unnamed illness swept through the Abbey. Dr. Lionel Grant, the town physician, described in his affidavit that he was refused entry more than once, though he heard coughing behind the doors. When he finally entered on the insistence of the sheriff, he found only 4 nuns, pale and feverish, the others said to be at retreat. No burial records were ever filed for the missing 2. When the constable questioned Sister Imelda, she answered calmly that the departed had taken vows of silence beyond the veil. It was an odd phrasing, one that unsettled the record-keeper enough to underline it twice in his notes. The parish archives grow thin after that winter, but one dispatch remains. A report of distant fire seen above the ridge one night in early 1889, smoke curling upward and vanishing with the dawn. Townsfolk said it looked like a signal, not a disaster. No flames reached the forest floor. No alarms were raised, and still in the Abbey ledger for that same night, a single entry appears in Sister Imelda's hand. "Ash is the mark of renewal. Faith the seal." By early 1889, the Abbey's records grew sparse, written in a hurried, uneven hand. The entry for January 14th mentions, "The snows have not ceased. Our faith is tried in silence." Only a few outside accounts survive for that season, yet each hints at the same suffocating stillness over Ravenswood County. According to a letter kept in the diocesan archive, Father Redmond made a second journey up the ridge after hearing rumors that no bell had rung for Epiphany. He found the gates unlatched and the path crusted with soot. "Not ash from hearth or chimney," he wrote, "but as though the ground itself had burned. Inside, he met Sister Imelda alone in the refectory. She was thinner, her eyes bright as glass. She spoke of purification rites and of sealing sins in fire. When the priest demanded to see the others, she guided him toward the chapel. There he saw symbols traced in grey dust across the flagstones, rings and crosses drawn with deliberate care. He left before Compline, shaken, and his brief report to the parish ended with the words, "May he guard them from themselves." That letter, preserved beside an old clipping about Abbey the Younger, became a pivotal reference decades later, when historians sought to explain the tragedy. The parallels were impossible to ignore, both convents set apart on wind-struck cliffs, both ending in fire under vows of chastity and fear. Some modern editors claim Sister Imelda had read about Abbey's martyrdom and reinterpreted it as divine instruction. Others believed coincidence alone linked their fates. By spring, tradesmen noticed the Abbey's smoke again, but this time tinged with the sour smell of resin. When the sheriff rode up to inspect, he found the yard deserted. Doors stood open. A single black candle burned before the statue of St. Clara. In a ledger near the altar, written in several hands, were the lines, "Those who betray faith shall wear its mark." Ash binds the promise. The sheriff sealed the building and posted guards. Yet on the following night, villagers reported seeing lanterns moving inside. When they entered at dawn, no one remained, only the echo of soft chanting that faded as the doors creaked. County proceedings stretched through the summer of 1889. Witnesses contradicted one another. Some swore they saw 4 figures in habits walking toward the river. Others insisted all 6 had perished. A mass grave was searched but yielded only animal bones. The inquiry adjourned unresolved, and the abbey was declared spiritually vacant. Within a year, the building had fallen into ruin, its slate roof caved under heavy storms. From that point, the story fragmented into rumor. Travelers spoke of women seen on misted roads, faces veiled, hands streaked grey. One shepherd claimed he found a small brand in the shape of a cross pressed into the bark of a pine above the ridge. Whether human or accident, he could not say. The parish allowed the forest to reclaim the path. The abbey's stones sank slowly into moss and soil, as if pulled downward by what they had witnessed. And still, in the parish's closing summary for 1890, the clerk added a single line, "Let their silence remain sealed beneath the ash." The phrase echoed through later academic papers comparing Ravenswood to older martyr legends, again invoking the record of Abbey the Younger as both precedent and warning. By then, the county had long ceased to speak of the sisters, except in hushed remembrance when smoke drifted from the hills each autumn evening and the bells of Coldwater tolled without wind. When the last formal inquiry closed in 1890, the Ravenswood Abbey site passed into legal limbo. The diocesan board debated whether to demolish the remaining structures, but funding delays and regional floods postponed any action. What remained of the East Wing became a nesting place for owls and foxes, its stone corridors echoing each gust of wind like a human sigh. Coldwater residents avoided the ridge entirely. Only the archivist, Mr. Edwin Merton, dared to visit monthly, noting in his log the gradual decay of the abbey walls. "The ash smell persists," he wrote on one entry, "as though the fire never ceased but merely hid itself in the stones." That same summer, Merton uncovered a sealed wooden chest beneath the sacristy floor. Inside were 3 charred books, each bound in scorched leather, and a handful of melted brass candle cups. 2 of the books were beyond saving, but fragments of the third revealed short confessions written in alternating hands. One line, legible even through soot, read, "They lied beneath the cross and shall wear its dust." Merton, alarmed, forwarded the relics to the bishop's office in Norwich. Yet according to a margin note added later, the package never arrived. Whether lost in transit or suppressed by church officials, no trace of the chest remains. By 1892, a new curate was appointed to Coldwater Parish, Father Alaric Dempsey, a mild man of letters with an interest in early monastic chronicles. He referred repeatedly in his sermons to the example of Abbey the Younger, emphasizing that faith could turn both to salvation and ruin when zeal overran reason. Villagers recognized the indirect reference, but avoided the topic. Dempsey's surviving correspondence hints that he visited the abbey site alone on several occasions. "The ruin is colder than open ground," he wrote in one letter to a fellow cleric, "and though all is still, One senses presence rather than absence. In early 1893, the county began plans to repurpose the remaining stones for a small mission school. Laborers arrived, dismantling parts of the west cloister. On the third morning, one worker uncovered a cavity in the wall filled with compacted ash. Within lay 2 rosaries fused by heat and a half-melted iron cross. The foreman ordered the section sealed and halted the project indefinitely. His statement to the constable survives in the ledger. "There's nothing holy in that foundation. It breathes when struck." From then onward, no one attempted further reclamation. The abbey fell deeper into ruin. Its boundary stones toppled into the brush. Visitors described the ridge as unnaturally quiet. Birds avoided nesting near the chapel arch. Yet on windless nights, travelers still claimed to see faint embers along the path. Small orange flickers, as if the ground itself exhaled light. The Coldwater Chronicle published one brief mention in 1895. Shepherds report unusual glow above Ravenswood. Authorities decline comment. Later historians would remark that those recurring accounts coincided with church debates about mystical martyrdoms, again citing Abbey the Younger as a distant but haunting parallel. In both legends, the faithful sought purity through flame, misled by conviction or despair. Whether Sister Imelda ever intended such an end remains unknown, yet her surviving phrase, "Ash is the mark of renewal, faith the seal," lingered in theological circles for decades. By the end of the century, moss had overtaken the remaining arches, and the abbey was officially struck from diocesan registers. Yet locals swore that every October, on the anniversary of the first sighted smoke, the air above the ridge still carried a faint scent of burnt oil and incense, mingled with something colder, the residue of devotion turned inward, still smouldering in the silence of Ravenswood. By the turn of 1896, the last traces of Ravenswood Abbey seemed ready to vanish. The parish's final mention that year referred to the site as dormant land under diocesan silence. Yet that silence did not last. In June, a group of university antiquarians from Durham arrived, hoping to study what remained of the abbey's architecture. Among them was Dr. Henry Elcott, a historian specializing in early convent martyrdoms. His notebooks, preserved in the county museum, provide the most detailed description of the ruins before they were overtaken by ivy. Elcott recorded the foundation's precise orientation, an east-west axis consistent with Benedictine design, but noted unusual markings in the mortar joints, circular etchings filled with fine ash. He described the texture as powdered bone or burnt lime, too smooth for mere residue. When his assistant, Miss Clara Wren, collected a sample, it emitted a faint warmth, though no embers were visible. The group concluded it might be chemical decay from old oil residue. Still, Elcott remarked that the scent of pitch evokes accounts of Coldingham's convent under Abbey the Younger, wherein sacred fire was both purifier and punishment. That comparison, made offhand in his notes, revived interest in the legend and the abbey's mystery alike. Local newspapers reported that the scholars had found relics of ritual combustion, though Elcott later protested the exaggeration. Even so, curious travelers began climbing the ridge again. They returned with their own accounts, soft bells ringing from the wind, footprints leading nowhere, and once, according to a schoolteacher, a single candle's flame flickering where no wax or wick could be found. In September, a storm tore across Coldwater. Lightning struck near the abbey's nave, igniting the undergrowth. When rain doused the blaze, the workers clearing debris found a hollow beneath the altar, its stone lid cracked open. Inside, wrapped in soot-black linen, lay a small wooden reliquary marked with an incised cross. Inside was only ash. County authorities removed it to the parish vault, but days later the sealed crate was reported empty. No break-in was discovered. The hinges showed no tampering. Elcott's journal ends abruptly that autumn. His final entry, dated 19th of September 1896, reads, "The air thickens near the chancel as though breathing smoke again. I hear voices where walls have fallen." Their hymn carries neither mercy nor malice, only persistence. He never published his findings, and his papers were later found singed at the edges, though the fire had spared the desk itself. Within 2 years, all remaining structures collapsed. The abbey became nothing more than a scatter of stones buried under moss and grass. Only the villagers' sayings kept the name alive. When the ash stirs, faith remembers. Each generation repeated it without knowing its origin. But even now, in old ledgers and marginalia, one can trace the echo of that forgotten fire, and the women who sealed their devotion with flame. Their legacy forever intertwined with the cautionary chronicles of Abbey the Younger. As the new century approached, Ravenswood County settled into uneasy forgetfulness. By 1901, only older residents recalled the ridge's precise location, and the parish had long since reassigned its records to diocesan storage. Yet that year brought a brief resurgence of interest when a traveling folklorist, Miss Eleanor Price, arrived to document northern religious legends. Her research, later cited in local papers, blended rumor and record, reviving the tale of the vanished sisters. Price's field notes, stored in the Coldwater Historical Society, reveal a measured approach. She interviewed descendants of townsfolk who had lived near the Abbey and transcribed oral accounts about women in grey habits wandering by the river after the fire. Most described them not as vengeful spirits but as watchers, silent figures who left no tracks in mud or snow. Price compared these accounts to medieval martyrdoms, noting again the uncanny similarity to the tragedy of Abbey the Younger, where devotion and despair had intertwined within stone walls centuries earlier. One evening in October 1901, Price climbed the ridge herself, accompanied by two locals. They found little more than rubble, yet beneath the moss she noticed distinct burn rings in the soil. Her lantern revealed a series of shallow impressions, almost like footprints circling the place where the altar once stood. In her journal she wrote, "The prints are neither human nor animal. They begin and end in the same place, as if a procession ceased and vanished mid-step." That night she and her companions camped by the remains of the outer wall. Around midnight, a wind rose abruptly, scattering ashes from their fire across the ground. One man swore the embers formed a cross before dying out, though Price dismissed it as coincidence. Still, she wrote later that the smoke drifted downward rather than upward, like breath returning to the earth, returning to town. Price submitted a short article to the Coldwater Chronicle, titled "Faith in the Flames, a Lost Abbey Remembered." The piece treated the sisters not as villains, but as zealots undone by isolation, remarking that fire has ever been the instrument of both purification and concealment. It received modest attention, but within weeks, her lodging housekeeper reported strange occurrences: fine soot on the windowsills each morning, and faint singing near the garden wall before dawn. Price's diary ends soon after with an unfinished sentence: "They are not gone, only waiting for the—" When her belongings were collected by relatives months later, a constable noted that her boots and lantern were streaked grey, as though she'd walked through a cold fire. The ridge was searched again, but no new evidence surfaced. By 1905, Coldwater residents had grown accustomed to the story's periodic reappearance. Each retelling shifted tone, sometimes moral lesson, sometimes ghost tale. Yet in every version the refrain endured: ashes, faith and silence. Local preachers used it as caution against excessive piety, citing Abbey the Younger in sermons as a saint whose flame saved her honor but cost her sisters their lives. The comparison lent the Ravenswood case a grim legitimacy that kept scholars debating for decades. And though the site itself had faded into woodland, travelers continued to claim that at dusk the ridge glowed faintly, never with fire, but with the dim hue of candlelight sunk deep beneath the earth, flickering where no candles burned. By the spring of 1906, Ravenswood Abbey had nearly dissolved into folklore. The diocese marked the ridge as consecrated ruin, forbidding further excavation, yet curiosity persisted among younger scholars. That April, Reverend Dr. William Havers, a historian of ecclesiastical psychology, arrived from York to conduct what he termed a pastoral ethnography. His Letters to the Anglican Review described the surrounding woods as so quiet that one hears the pulse in one's own ears. Havers interviewed aging locals, most of whom recalled fragments: a fire that never spread, nuns who vanished without witness, and the scent of oil lingering decades later. One farmer, Elias Rowe, claimed his grandfather had seen 6 figures kneeling in the blaze, heads bowed, no cries at all. Havers recorded the statement without judgment, remarking that the story reflected collective guilt rather than memory. He compared it to chronicled accounts of Abbey the Younger, whose own act of fiery sacrifice was later softened by centuries of retelling. The mention framed the Ravenswood tale not as heresy or miracle, but as moral confusion. A community's attempt to make sense of devotion turned destructive. While exploring the ruins, Havers discovered a slab partially buried near the old cloister path. Its surface bore faint lettering, perhaps scratched by metal or stone. "Faith binds, flame frees." He had the fragment transported to his rectory in town for study. Days later, the stone was found cracked in two, edges blackened, though no fire had been lit. The rector's maid testified that a thin layer of ash covered the floor that morning, as though from chimney soot, though every grate was cold. In August, Havers presented his findings to a small circle of clergy and historians. He argued that the Ravenswood incident exemplified psychogenic martyrdom, a phenomenon where isolation and religious extremity mimic sanctified behavior. "They believed themselves instruments," he wrote, "as Abbey believed herself shielded by flame from defilement." His remarks drew criticism from church officials who feared the comparison diminished sainthood, yet privately they acknowledged the disturbing resemblance. Havers remained in Coldwater through the autumn. His journal shows growing obsession. Sketches of the Abbey foundations, maps of nearby springs and repeated notations of faint chanting heard near the ridge at dusk. On October 22nd he wrote, "The wind carries harmonies beyond comprehension, each note a breath upon ash." That was his final entry. He disappeared 2 nights later. Search parties found his satchel and notebook beside the ridge, both dusted grey. The bishop ordered the area sealed again, this time by decree. A wooden cross was erected at the trailhead with the inscription, "Peace to those who sought it in flame." The phrase became a local proverb used by farmers when winter fires burned out of control. By 1910, only fragments of the Abbey stones remained visible. Moss smothered the altar site. Saplings took root through the nave. Yet travellers continued to report a strange stillness in the air, a lull before thunder, even on clear days. One traveller, a visiting teacher, noted that her compass needle spun wildly near the ruins, as though searching for north among the dead. In that same year, an anonymous pamphlet circulated through seminaries titled "The Ash of Faith." It offered a retelling of the Ravenswood tragedy, citing Abbey the Younger as its historical reflection. Scholars suspected it had been compiled from Havers's missing notes. The closing lines read simply, "The fire did not consume them. It taught them to remain unseen." No author was ever identified, but the pamphlet marked the last recorded reference to the Abbey before the First World War. After that, Ravenswood faded from the archives, leaving behind only the lingering scent of smoke and the uneasy notion that faith, once ignited, does not easily die. After the turn of the century's second decade, Ravenswood Abbey existed only as a rumour drawn from older men's fireside talk. The war in Europe soon diverted attention from forgotten convents and ancient ashes. Yet in 1914, as the world burned anew, the county's young recruits marching to the trains spoke quietly of the hill that first taught fire to pray. Their officers dismissed it as superstition, but the phrase clung to the region's tongue, appearing even in letters sent home from the front. Among those soldiers was Corporal Edwin Vale, grandson of the carpenter who once worked on the Abbey's roof. In a letter dated August 1915, he wrote to his sister, "Trenches smell of oil and cinders here, not unlike the old ridge father warned us about. The men say the air thickens before bombardment, the same way it did before storms at Ravenswood." The letter reached Coldwater weeks later, after Vale was listed missing in action. His sister placed it in the parish records where it remains, a haunting echo of 2 distant fires bound by fear and faith. That same winter, civilians returning to the countryside found the ridge strangely disturbed. Soldiers on leave reported finding new footprints pressed into the frost, bare, small, and leading only halfway to the old gate. Reverend Phelps, caretaker of the parish, organized a brief blessing at the site. His written account in the diocesan register describes a palpable stillness, not of peace but of expectancy. When he sprinkled holy water over the remaining stones, steam rose faintly, though the air was below freezing. It smelled not of sulphur, he added, but of lamp oil. Historians decades later would draw parallels once more to Abbey the Younger, whose legend, they noted, had resurfaced in wartime sermons as an example of sanctified defiance. The invocation rekindled speculation that Ravenswood's story had been a misinterpreted imitation, faith expressed through flame when words failed. Newspapers briefly revisited the tale, calling it the Northern Convent mystery, but no investigation followed. In 1916, a travelling Red Cross nurse named Beatrice Rowan stopped in Coldwater while en route to Edinburgh. Her diary recounts a detour up the ridge, prompted by curiosity after hearing villagers warn her not to go. She found the ruins nearly gone, only a few foundation stones visible among wild heather. But near dusk she noticed something peculiar, ash swirling at her feet though the ground was damp from rain. "It rose as if drawn by breath," she wrote. "For a moment I thought I heard chanting, not loud but steady like the hum of wires." Rowan collected a small handful of the ash in a glass vial and took it with her overseas. 2 years later, a field physician recorded that she kept the vial on her desk throughout the war. When a shell exploded near the infirmary in 1918, her tent burned entirely, except for that vial found intact, sealed in soot but unbroken. The ash inside had fused into a pale grey stone. By 1919, Coldwater's population had thinned, families lost sons, and farms went untended. The ridge grew wild again, reclaiming its silence. Travellers said that after dusk, faint lights flickered where the Abbey once stood, sometimes red, sometimes blue, never steady. Locals called them the Sisters' Lamps. Whether they were gas pockets, will-o'-the-wisps, or tricks of grief-stricken eyes, no one proved. Yet even the skeptics admitted that the air above Ravenswood carried a lingering warmth, as if memory itself still smouldered beneath the soil. And in parish ledgers compiled that same year, a new hand wrote across the margin, "Do not disturb the ground. Their faith endures where flame cannot." It was unsigned, the ink pale and uneven, as though written by someone whose fingers trembled or who feared that even now the ashes might awaken. By 1920, the ridge above Coldwater was almost unrecognizable. Trees had reclaimed the Abbey site, their roots splitting the last flagstones and curling through the remnants of the nave. Ravenswood, once a name whispered in dread, had become a ghostly footnote in county registers. Yet one final discovery would momentarily draw the world's gaze back to that desolate hill. In the summer of that year, a local rail crew extending the northern spur line uncovered a buried stone vault while cutting through the ridge's lower slope. Expecting old drainage works, they broke the seal and found a narrow chamber filled with soot. Inside were fragments of carved wood and a tarnished brass censer, still faintly scented of oil and incense. The foreman, Henry Clark, filed an official report noting, "The chamber's air warm to the touch, though sealed tight." County constables cordoned off the site, and soon after, an ecclesiastical historian from Durham, Professor Alastair Penford, was dispatched to examine it. Penford's report, stored in diocesan archives, described the vault as a mortuary or chapel annex dating to the mid-19th century. He recorded faded Latin inscriptions on the walls, one reading Persineris Fidei, through the ashes of faith. The phrase immediately drew comparisons to a passage in a medieval account of Abbey the Younger, which spoke of purity preserved through sacred flame. In correspondence to a colleague, Penford mused, "It is as if Ravenswood's builders meant to repeat the same vow, a reflection in stone of that ancient legend." While surveying the chamber, Penford's team found small patches of crystalline residue among the ash. When disturbed, the material gave off a faint phosphorescent glow, briefly illuminating the vault with a soft amber light. The scientists who later analyzed it could not identify its composition. They suggested phosphorus from decayed bone or resin. Still, rumors spread quickly. Villagers called it the fire that breathes without smoke. A local photographer, Samuel Dyer, was permitted to document the excavation. His surviving plate negatives reveal strange anomalies, halos of blurred light around the figures of workers, streaks across the frames like faint crosses. Dyer dismissed it as chemical error, but when he returned to his darkroom weeks later, the same distortions appeared even in exposures taken far from the ridge. "As though the lens remembered what it saw," he told a friend before abandoning photography altogether. By late autumn, the vault was resealed. The diocese ordered its entrance hidden under fresh stone, citing spiritual sensitivity. But the act stirred disquiet among residents who feared tampering with sacred ground. For months afterward, strange smells of oil and faint warmth were reported in nearby farmhouses. Livestock refused to graze near the slope. A letter from a tenant farmer in December 1920 notes, "The earth hums after dark. Even the dogs will not linger." Penford concluded his final field notes with an uneasy reflection. There is in Ravenswood a persistence of combustion not of the physical world. Faith burns here still, unseen yet unspent. As the new decade dawned, snow buried the ridge once more. From the valley below, travellers sometimes saw a dim shimmer above the trees, as if moonlight struck metal deep underground. Whether natural reflection or something older, no one determined. The parish clerk simply added a final marginal remark in the 1921 ledger: "The fire sleeps." Yet among locals, another phrase replaced it, half warning, half prayer. When the ash wakes, so will the faithful. And though the Abbey itself was long gone, the people of Coldwater still crossed themselves when they passed beneath that ridge. Afraid that somewhere beneath the soil, the vow of Ravenswood remained unbroken. By the mid-1920s, Coldwater had settled into a kind of collective amnesia. New factories along the river replaced farms, and the few who still remembered the Ravenswood Abbey fire were too old to climb the ridge. Yet echoes of the story persisted, especially among the schoolchildren who walked past the overgrown path each morning. They called it the Sisters' Stairs, claiming that if one counted the steps aloud after dusk, a whisper would interrupt before the final number. Teachers scolded them for superstition, but the tales grew. That same year, a civic survey was commissioned to map rural water sources for the expanding town. Among the hired engineers was Mr. Charles Wren, a methodical man with no patience for folklore. His field diary records his first sight of the ridge on 9 August 1924. The ground feels hollow underfoot, as though air moves beneath. Campus readings erratic. While digging a test pit near the old foundation line, Wren struck a layer of fine grey sediment unlike surrounding clay. He collected a handful, describing it as ash-soft but cold, the scent faintly metallic. When samples reached the university laboratory in York, analysts noted trace elements of iron, calcium and curiously human keratin. Wren's supervisor dismissed the anomaly as contamination from burial soil, yet the finding reached a local reporter. Within weeks, newspapers revived the legend under the headline "Fire of the Faithful May Have Been Real." Editorials speculated that the discovery confirmed ritual cremations. The diocese quickly issued a statement denying any link, reminding readers that the true history of the Abbey remained a closed chapter best left in reverence. Despite official silence, curiosity rekindled. Amateur historians retraced old records, connecting the recovered ash with fragments of correspondence from the earlier scholars: Elcott, Havers, Penford, all of whom had vanished or died under peculiar circumstances. A pamphlet circulated privately among theological societies titled "Ashes That Speak," arguing that Ravenswood represented a regional reenactment of the Coldingham martyrdom under Eber the Younger. It claimed Sister Imelda's community had modelled themselves consciously on that saint's legend. Seeing fire as the ultimate seal of devotion, critics dismissed it as speculation. Yet the parallel again rooted the Abbey firmly within sacred scholarly discourse. In October 1925, workers expanding the nearby rail spur reported an accident near the ridge. A small explosion, apparently caused by trapped gas, opened a shallow fissure across the path. When examined, the fissure emitted faint heat, though the soil above was cool. One witness, a foreman named Lewis Hale, described a smell of lamp oil and singed cloth. The company halted further work and diverted the line south. Hale later told a local paper it was like the ground remembered burning. After the incident, the county council fenced the area. For a time, calm returned. But winter brought peculiar weather, fog thick enough to hide the ridge entirely for days, followed by sudden bursts of light visible from town windows. Children claimed to see candles walking among the trees. Adults explained it as swamp gas, though none could find any bog on the hill. When spring came, the fog lifted, and with it several fence posts were found charred at their bases. The burns were too clean to be lightning. Constables dismissed vandalism, yet one officer privately remarked in his log, "Some fires need no flame to begin." By the decade's end, Coldwater moved on again, the ridge quietly absorbed by forest. But a final notation in the parish book for 1929 carries the same closing cadence that had followed every investigation for 40 years. Ash remains, faith endures, and though its author left no name, the handwriting matched that of earlier entries long thought lost. suggesting perhaps that one who had once written of Ravenswood still lived nearby, watching as the Abbey's memory refused to die. When the 1930s began, the world beyond Coldwater surged toward modernity. Telephones, automobiles, radios humming through the valley, but on the ridge where Ravenswood Abbey once stood, time refused to move. The forest canopy had thickened, cloaking the ruins entirely. Only a faint line of weathered stones hinted that something had ever been built there. Still, on moonlit nights the townsfolk swore the hill seemed lighter than the woods around it, as though the earth held its own glow. In 1931, a government mapping project brought surveyors back to the area. Among them was Lieutenant Harold Bent, a veteran of the Great War with an eye for anomalies. His field log, later discovered in a box of disused instruments, recorded that his compass needle spins without cause near the ridge, and that his boots left prints which vanished by next morning. Bent, curious but cautious, ordered his crew to avoid digging within 50 yards of the old boundary markers. Yet one apprentice ignored him, prying loose a stone from what proved to be the Abbey's outer wall. Beneath it lay a hollow filled with soot. When the stone cracked open, the soot ignited, not with flame but with a sudden blue shimmer that vanished instantly. No one was burned, but the entire crew smelled oil for hours afterward. The incident made its way into a small notice in the Coldwater Gazette, where the editor half-jokingly titled the piece, "The Ridge That Still Breathes Fire." It might have ended there, had not the town librarian, Miss Ruth Penford, niece of the earlier scholar Alistair Penford, decided to investigate. She retrieved her uncle's papers, comparing his notes on phosphorescent ash to the surveyor's descriptions. Her conclusion, presented quietly to the county board, was that the chemical residue of the Abbey fire remains reactive, sustained by trapped gases and perhaps by superstition itself. The phrase amused the commissioners, but unsettled the clergy. In her private diary, however, Miss Penford wrote a more chilling entry. "Each page I turn in Uncle's notebook smells faintly of smoke." Even after 40 years, she later travelled up the ridge with 2 assistants to photograph the remains. The negatives preserved in the Coldwater archives show indistinct forms, columns of pale mist shaped like kneeling figures. She insisted these were merely tricks of exposure, but she never developed the remaining plates. Within a month, she resigned her post and left the town without notice. Meanwhile, Coldwater's new vicar, Father Rowan, delivered a sermon warning against seeking holiness in ruin. He referenced the case of Abbey the Younger, explaining that to kindle faith through destruction is to mistake devotion for pride. His words, meant as metaphor, reignited fascination with the Abbey's past. Parishioners began visiting the ridge again, leaving candles at the edge of the path despite the diocese's ban. On windy nights, those candles guttered but never went out, a fact that kept the legend alive. By 1935, the site had become a reluctant pilgrimage. Travelers came quietly, lighting candles or sprinkling ash from church hearths for remembrance. The clergy frowned but tolerated it. A local journalist who visited that summer wrote, "There is no ruin here, no visible stone, yet one feels the weight of architecture in the air, as if invisible walls still rise around the faithful who dare to kneel." That autumn, a dry thunderstorm passed over Coldwater. Residents later claimed that lightning struck the ridge, igniting no fire but filling the valley with the scent of incense. For days afterward, a faint grey dust coated the town's windowsills. Some called it soot from far-off factories. Others whispered it was a reminder that somewhere under layers of soil and time, the sisters of Ravenswood still kept their vigil, the vow unbroken, their faith sealed forever in ash and silence. By the late 1930s, the name Ravenswood had nearly vanished from official memory. The parish had merged with neighbouring Coldwater Downs, its ledgers boxed and forgotten in a damp rectory cellar. Yet each autumn, the ridge continued to draw the curious. Students, occult enthusiasts, even a few clergymen, hoping to dispel the myth. The forest floor swallowed what little path remained, and in its centre stood a single iron cross, rusted but upright, marking where the Abbey's chapel once rose. Those who touched it said it felt warm even in frost. In 1938, a visiting lecturer from Edinburgh, Dr. Lionel March, came to Coldwater to study persistent religious hauntings. His field notebooks, now held in the university's anthropology archives, reveal both skepticism and awe. March approached the site in early November, describing the woods as deadly still, save for the pulse of one's breath. At twilight he noted that the air grew heavy and smelled faintly of burnt wax. In the soil he found small white flakes that crumbled into powder between his fingers, remnants that chemical testing later identified as calcium phosphate mixed with carbonized oil. The laboratory reports could not explain why the samples emitted measurable heat even hours after removal. In his lectures the following year, March referenced Abbey the Younger to illustrate how fire had served as both sanctuary and sentence in monastic narratives. From Coldingham to Ravenswood, he said, the faithful have long mistaken immolation for absolution. His remarks drew controversy, especially among the clergy who viewed the comparison as heretical. Yet March insisted that the two stories mirrored each other in structure and tone. The isolated community, the moral dread of sin, the cleansing flame, and the silent aftermath that leaves historians chasing ash. A local woman, Martha Vale, descendant of one of the original Abbey workers, attended one of March's talks. In her diary she recorded a curious experience. When he spoke the Abbey's name, the lantern above us flickered and smoked black. She later wrote to a friend that March visited the ridge again the next morning to prove the superstition false. He never returned. Searchers found his hat and walking stick beside the iron cross. Both were dusted with fine grey ash. The ground around them was warm, though the night had frozen. Newspapers covered the disappearance for weeks, dubbing him the last pilgrim of Ravenswood. The public speculated everything from accident to foul play, but the inquest concluded only absence without evidence. The diocese promptly fenced off the ridge once more, posting a simple wooden sign, "No entry, consecrated ground." Winter settled quickly that year. Snow blanketed the forest, muting every sound. Travelers along the valley road claimed to see faint lights moving within the trees, soft even, like candles borne by a hidden procession. One truck driver swore he heard singing as he passed, a low harmony that followed his vehicle until the road curved away. When he told the story later, townsfolk reminded him that no one had lived near the ridge for 50 years. The outbreak of war in 1939 soon buried all talk of the Abbey again. Men left, families fled cities, and cold water became a waypoint for evacuees. The ridge stood untouched, a silent witness to history repeating itself beyond its borders. Yet soldiers billeted in the valley reported restless sleep, describing dreams of cloister bells and walls lit by red light. One wrote home, "It feels as though the ground remembers every fire ever set upon it." When peace returned years later, so did the forest. The iron cross still stood, streaked black with age, and the path had narrowed to a deer trail. Only the faint scent of burnt oil lingered after rain, a ghostly perfume of devotion that would not die, whispering of nuns, of silence, and of faith too fierce to fade. By the early 1940s, war consumed the world again, yet Coldwater Ridge remained untouched, too remote for industry, too steep for farming. Refugees from nearby cities occasionally camped at its base, unaware of the Abbey's legend. Some returned with stories that soon revived the old unease. One woman, recorded in a 1942 Red Cross log, claimed she saw figures in dark robes moving between trees, their faces lit as if from within. Authorities attributed it to exhaustion or trauma, but locals took it as proof that Ravenswood Abbey still held vigil through the decades. That winter, a detachment of Home Guard soldiers was stationed near the ridge to monitor air traffic. Corporal Thomas Merrin kept a meticulous diary describing nightly patrols. On 18th of December, he wrote, "Ground temperature abnormally high, boots steaming though snow lies thick. Compasses fail near the cross." The following week, he and two others followed faint singing toward the upper slope. They found no source, but discovered shallow depressions in the snow arranged in a circular pattern, each about the size of a kneeling figure. When daylight came, the prints had vanished. Merrin's diary ends abruptly that month. He was transferred, then disappeared en route to London. In 1944, the War Ministry ordered a geological survey of the area for potential fuel storage. Engineers uncovered traces of gas pockets beneath the ridge, residue from decayed oil veins, and recommended sealing them. However, when workers began drilling, every borehole filled instantly with grey dust. The site foreman described the smell as sacristy smoke, not chemical. After several men fell ill with severe coughing fits, the project was abandoned. One report buried in ministry archives concluded, combustible material of unknown origin, possibly organic ash, continues to emit low heat. The incident reached local papers once again, reviving comparisons to ancient monastic fires. Columnist Harold Dent wrote in the Yorkshire Review, "It seems the ashes of Ravenswood still breathe, echoing the story of Abbey the Younger, who once found grace in flame and left her convent forever marked by it." His essay drew ire from church officials but reawakened academic interest. Soon letters poured into Coldwater's rectory, asking to see surviving parish ledgers. Few realized most records had already disintegrated from damp, leaving only those eerie marginal notes penned decades earlier, each repeating the refrain, "Ash remains, faith endures." After the war, a wave of reconstruction swept the country. Roads were widened, houses rebuilt, and forgotten ruins erased. Yet whenever crews approached the ridge to clear timber, machinery faltered. Engines stalled without reason, compasses spun, and in one instance an entire truck rolled backward despite level ground. Workers refused to continue. The contractor, in frustration, declared the land cursed and left it untouched. In 1947, the last surviving witness to the original events, an elderly Sister Margaretine, once a novice at a neighboring convent, granted a brief interview to a regional paper. Her words were faint but firm. They sought to burn away their guilt, but the fire took their prayers instead. It still holds them. She died 2 weeks later, her effects, including a small rosary, fused together by heat. By decade's end, nature had fully reclaimed the ridge. Trees grew where the Abbey's cloisters had stood, their trunks twisted as if molded by old smoke. The iron cross rusted to its base, half buried. Only a few hikers ventured near, and even they noted an inexplicable warmth seeping from the soil on cold mornings. One left a note in the visitor's ledger at the Coldwater Inn. "No sound, no birds, only the scent of burned incense." The place breathes in silence, and thus through war and renewal the memory persisted, quiet, unprovable, but alive. A place where belief had once burned so fiercely that the earth itself seemed unable to forget, where faith still lingered beneath layers of ash, whispering faintly through the trees of a convent that refused to die. By the early 1950s, Ravenswood Ridge had become a forgotten patch of woodland, marked only on survey maps as disused ecclesiastical site. Few outsiders knew the story, and even fewer locals dared to speak it aloud. Yet interest flickered again when a small archaeological society from Newcastle sought permission to document medieval remains in North Yorkshire. Their records, careful, factual, and quietly unnerving, preserved the last detailed account of what the ridge revealed before it was sealed for good. The expedition, led by Dr. Edith Canning in the summer of 1952, expected to find little more than foundations. Instead, her team uncovered traces of burnt plaster and charred stone, forming a circular perimeter around what had once been the chapel floor. The soot layer was so uniform that Canning concluded it had been deliberately applied, not caused by accidental fire. Samples collected for analysis showed the same blend found in earlier reports, mineral ash laced with organic residue. "It behaves almost alive," she wrote, warming the instruments though no heat source is present. Local laborers assisting the dig grew uneasy. One man swore he heard murmurs rising from the soil when spades struck deep. Another refused to return after dusk, claiming that the air sang like wires when the ground was opened. Canning, a strict rationalist, dismissed these accounts, but admitted in her journal that her compass spun erratically whenever she stood near the site's center. She compared the experience to reports from electrical storms without thunder. The dig lasted barely 3 weeks. On the final day, the crew uncovered a row of stone fragments shaped like kneelers. Beneath them lay a rusted iron box no larger than a prayer book. When pried open, it contained only grey dust and a folded scrap of vellum inked in Latin. Per fidem flamma servat. Faith preserves through flame. The phrase appeared, once again nearly identical to the martyr's motto recorded in the annals of Abbey the Younger, confirming that whoever inscribed it had known that legend intimately. Canning's assistant photographed the find, but when the film was developed, the image showed a white glare radiating from the box as though the ash itself emitted light. That night, The team camped nearby to catalogue artifacts. Wind rose after midnight, carrying with it a scent of burned oil. One worker reported seeing faint red points among the trees, steady, deliberate, like lanterns being carried uphill. In the morning, several tools were found arranged in a perfect circle around the campfire, dusted with soot. Canning recorded the incident, but offered no explanation beyond local prank. After returning to Newcastle, she planned to publish her report under the title Fire and Devotion, The Last Abbey of Ravenswood. The manuscript never appeared. Her colleagues later found her notes scorched around the edges, her typewriter fused where ribbon met metal. No blaze had been recorded in her home. The coroner listed the cause as electrical fault, though no wiring existed in the attic where she worked. The diocese quickly claimed the recovered relics and ordered the ridge closed for indefinite preservation. Fencing was replaced, signage removed, and within months new trees were planted to conceal all trace of excavation. Ravenswood disappeared again, this time not through neglect but through deliberate burial. Still, among the surviving papers in Canning's archive, one margin bears a chilling annotation written in her own hand: "The ash breathes." It stands as the last written testimony before the ridge was finally abandoned to silence. By the decade's end, Coldwater residents said the forest had grown unnaturally lush, the soil black and fertile, as though nourished by more than earth. On humid evenings, mist rose in narrow columns from the ground, glowing faintly before fading into air. No birds sang there. Travelers who passed along the valley road would glance toward the ridge, whisper a brief prayer and quicken their pace, lest the wind carry with it the faint smell of burning faith. By the turn of 1958, Ravenswood Ridge had become more rumor than ruin, its story surviving only in whispered recollections, in files marked restricted, and in the journals of those who couldn't quite let go. The forest had swallowed the Abbey completely, but its presence lingered like a stain beneath the soil. To outsiders, Coldwater seemed unremarkable, yet those who lived near the ridge spoke softly of the warmth that never fades. That year, the government's Forestry Commission designated the ridge as protected woodland. A boundary trench was dug to mark the site, and workers were instructed not to dig below a meter. Foreman Arthur Rigg later testified that one of his crew ignored the order, driving a spade deeper to test the soil. Steam rose up, he recalled, as if the earth exhaled. The man dropped the tool, claiming it burned his palms, though no flame was seen. The trench filled itself with fine grey powder overnight, and by morning, the tools left there were coated in soot. Rigg reported the incident. His notes were quietly filed away. In the same year, a young historian named Peter Lambton visited Coldwater researching ritual architecture in post-Reformation convents. He interviewed elderly residents who remembered the stories told by their grandparents. One described light moving under the trees as though the ground had windows. Another claimed her mother had once seen women walking barefoot through frost, leaving no tracks. Lambton dismissed most as folklore, but one phrase recurred so often he marked it with asterisks: "Ash remembers." Intrigued, he traced earlier scholarship linking the Abbey to Eber the Younger, noting the repetition of the same vow, faith sealed in fire. In his article draft for the Journal of Ecclesiastical Studies, he wrote, "Ravenswood may represent a psychological inheritance of martyrdom, a communal reenactment of sanctified immolation meant to reconcile guilt through combustion." He never submitted the piece. Weeks later, Lambton disappeared after visiting the ridge at dusk. His bicycle was found leaning against the gate, its tires coated with a grey film. A search party found no sign of struggle, only a shallow depression in the leaves and a faint odor of oil and incense. Constable Dyer, descendant of the old photographer, wrote in his report, "Soil remains warm to the touch, yet no embers, no fire, no smoke. The case was closed quietly as missing, presumed lost in forested terrain. For months afterward, faint light was seen flickering among the trees, steady, candle-like, never bright enough to be flame. Hikers called them the sisters' lamps. When the phenomenon reached the newspapers, officials dismissed it as foxfire, though no phosphorescent fungus was ever recorded there. Local radio ran a brief segment comparing the legend once more to the martyrdom of Eber, remarking that the past burns longest where faith and fire once met. In December 1958, A small landslide exposed part of the old Abbey foundation. Parish officials visited, photographed the remains, then filled the area with earth. Before they left, one clerk, whose name remains illegible in the report, scribbled a note on the final page. The stones breathe heat at dusk. Do not open again. Winter closed in and the valley quieted beneath snow. Travelers said the ridge glowed faintly through fog, pulsing like the ember of a buried forge. The wind carried the scent of burnt wax and iron, faint but persistent. And though no one lived within miles, some swore they heard distant chanting when the air was still. Low, rhythmic, rising and falling with the sound of rustling leaves, as if unseen voices still kept their endless vespers beneath the weight of years and ash. By the early 1960s, Ravenswood Ridge was officially forgotten. It appeared only as a shaded patch on ordnance maps, its name omitted from new surveys. The road that once led toward Coldwater's northern woods was rerouted, leaving the ridge accessible only by footpaths. But for all the silence surrounding it, the story continued to whisper, passed between archivists, church clerks, and a few restless students who found hints of it buried in library catalogues. One such student was Margaret Elcott, great-granddaughter of Dr. Henry Elcott, the 19th-century scholar whose notes had first revived the legend. In 1962, while researching at Durham, she uncovered a sealed envelope labeled Ravenswood, Private. Inside were brittle papers, bearing her ancestors' handwriting, and a small square of vellum covered in grey dust. The inscription read simply, Per Cineres Fide. Elcott recognized the Latin immediately, through the ashes of faith, and the echo of Ebba the Younger's convent. Her curiosity turned to obsession. She traveled to Coldwater that summer, finding the town smaller, poorer, and largely unaware of its history. Locals shrugged at her questions. One elderly innkeeper told her, "There's nothing left up there but trees and prayers gone bad." Against all advice, Elcott hiked to the ridge alone. Her diary, recovered later from the parish rectory, recounts her approach in steady detail. Air grows warmer as one climbs. Soil darker, scent metallic. I hear something like wind, but it breathes. She described reaching the clearing near sunset. No ruin visible, she wrote, yet the earth seems patterned, as if foundation lines still glow beneath the grass. She placed the vellum on the ground and recited the Latin aloud. The wind rose sharply, circling me. I thought I heard women's voices, soft, overlapping, not mournful but resolute. Her next line trails into a blot of ink, and the diary ends mid-sentence. The next day, hikers found her satchel and camera at the base of an oak. The film inside contained 5 exposures, all overexposed by a pale glare. The local constable who developed them later said, "It looked like she'd taken pictures of fire, but no fire was there." Margaret Elcott was never found. The tragedy drew brief attention before vanishing again into bureaucracy. University officials sealed her grandfather's notes and prohibited further study. A small notice in the Durham Herald closed the case. Researcher lost in woodland accident. Yet in Coldwater, residents quietly repeated that the ridge had claimed its own blood, drawing a circle between past and present, between faith and inheritance. In 1965, the Forestry Commission revisited the site to plant a new line of birch trees. Workers reported an unusual warmth in the soil that dulled their tools. When they struck a stone slab, a vapor rose, clear, scentless, faintly luminous. The foreman, who had read about the ridge's past, ordered the hole filled immediately. That winter, snow refused to settle on the ridge even when the valley lay buried beneath white. From a distance it appeared dark and steaming, as if thawed by something beneath. The new vicar of Coldwater, Father Paul Ingram, wrote in his Christmas sermon, "Perhaps the ground remembers more than we allow. Faith may burn but never entirely dies." Villagers murmured that on the longest nights, faint bell tones drifted through the woods, 4 notes repeating. Some swore they saw brief sparks hovering above the birches, like fireflies that refused to fade. And though no one dared climb the ridge anymore, every household kept shutters closed when the wind blew from the north, carrying with it that faint, unmistakable scent, oil, incense, and the smoke of prayers that never found rest. By the early 1970s, modernization had erased most traces of the old parish. Coldwater merged administratively into a larger district, and the ridge was labeled on planning maps simply as Zone 47 Forestry Reserve. No mention of Ravenswood Abbey appeared in any official index, But among archivists and historians, the name persisted like an echo, a rumor no bureaucracy could quite silence. In 1972, a BBC radio program titled Forgotten Fires of England aired a brief segment on the legend, describing it as a provincial myth born of isolation and hysteria. Yet the broadcast sparked renewed curiosity. Letters poured in from listeners claiming family connections, lost journals, even sightings of ashen lights in the trees. One of those letters came from Dr. James Merrin, grandson of the wartime corporal, who had documented strange warmth near the ridge. A geologist by trade, Merrin requested permission to conduct a harmless soil survey under academic supervision. The Forestry Commission reluctantly agreed, stipulating no excavation deeper than 12 inches. His field report, now preserved in the university archives, reads like both science and confession. Soil temperature measured at 14 degrees Celsius above ambient. Stratigraphy uniform, though texture changes with prayer-like symmetry. Rings within rings of compressed ash. He added, the compass dies here. Needles freeze as if held by unseen magnetism. During his third visit, Merrin recorded faint vibration readings, oscillations not caused by wind or machinery. He compared them to breathing, noting they peaked precisely at sunset and ceased before dawn. He sent the data to colleagues in London, who dismissed it as instrument error. Yet the following month, the same vibration appeared in his laboratory basement when samples were unpacked. The caretaker described the air as smelling of candles and storm. Merrin destroyed the specimens the next day. The legend flared again in local press after a hiker reported seeing 6 pale shapes moving in formation near the ridge. The story ran under the headline, "The Sisters Returned to Ravenswood." Officials denied the claim, but visitors began leaving flowers and small candles near the forestry fence. Within days, the candles melted in identical spirals, their wicks untouched by flame. Photographs taken at dawn showed the wax arranged in a cross pattern, as if shaped by unseen heat. That summer, church authorities quietly reopened old files to assess whether the site still fell under ecclesiastical protection. A brief memo concluded, "Ground remains sanctified by ancient vow. Interference unwise." The bishop declined to comment publicly, though one aide later admitted that several letters from theologians compared the phenomenon once again to the act of Abbey the Younger, calling it the persistence of penitential fire. By autumn, the Forestry Commission sealed the access road entirely. A warning sign read, "Danger, unstable terrain." Yet hikers continued to report faint lights above the trees, particularly on overcast nights when no stars were visible. A Coldwater postman claimed he saw figures walking uphill, carrying something bright that gave no smoke. When he approached, the lights vanished, leaving behind a scent of oil and a patch of warm earth. In late 1975, Dr. Merrin published a short essay in a geological journal under a pseudonym. It ended with a line that blurred science and superstition alike. Some strata retain more than minerals. Some hold memory, warm, breathing, and unwilling to cool. Locals said afterward that he never returned to the ridge, but each year on the night of 21st October, the anniversary of the first recorded fire, someone left a single candle at the locked gate. It always burned low, never consumed, as though the wick itself refused the final spark. And so Ravenswood endured, invisible yet alive, a scar of belief, a wound of devotion, its soil still humming softly beneath the birch roots, keeping the vow that time and reason could not unmake. By the mid-1980s, the world had changed beyond recognition, but Ravenswood Ridge remained untouched, a quiet scar hidden behind new motorways and growing suburbs. On official records, it was Forestry Plot 47B, yet among Coldwater's dwindling elders, the name still stirred unease. Children dared one another to climb the overgrown path at dusk. None reached the summit. Those who tried spoke of heat underfoot and the faint scent of oil on the breeze. In 1983, a small team from the County Heritage Office attempted an environmental survey before proposed development. Lead analyst Dr. Helen Rowe described the soil as abnormally warm, sustaining vegetation months past frost. Instruments recorded low-frequency tremors, rhythmic as a pulse. When she compared the data with older files, she found identical readings noted by Merrin and Canning decades earlier. Her notebook contains a single marginal question mark beside the words, "continuous combustion." Rose's assistant reported hearing choral tones while logging samples. She dismissed it as wind resonance, but her audio recorder captured faint harmonics impossible to trace to natural sources. Engineers tested for underground cables. None existed. The anomaly was classified under acoustic interference. Later that week, Rose discovered soot on her instruments, though no open flame had been used. Her supervisor ordered the study closed, declaring the ridge ecologically sensitive. All files were sealed in the county archive. Still, rumors escaped. Local newspapers revived the legend, linking it once again to Abbey the Younger, suggesting that the nuns of Ravenswood had reenacted the saint's final act of devotion. The article ended with the line, "Some fires never cool. They change shape." Pilgrims began arriving quietly, leaving candles at the locked gate despite posted warnings. Each morning the groundskeeper found the wax melted flat, yet no wick burned. In 1985, a severe drought swept northern England. Forest fires erupted miles away, yet when flames neared Coldwater, rain fell suddenly, only over the ridge. Witnesses claimed the downpour hissed like steam and smelled of incense. Firefighters later said the ground beneath the rain remained warm to the touch. The event went unreported beyond local radio, which concluded with the haunting observation, "The old abbey protects itself." Afterward, the Forestry Commission fenced the area permanently, planting rows of birch to obscure the hill. A weather station installed nearby failed within a week, its wiring corroded as if exposed to salt or soot. When technicians replaced it, the same decay reappeared. They abandoned the effort. By 1989, Coldwater was little more than a name on maps. The ridge lay silent beneath its canopy, unseen yet restless. Travelers along the motorway sometimes glimpsed a faint orange shimmer through the trees, dismissing it as distant headlights. Those who stopped swore they smelled burning wax, and so the story closed where it began. With whispers, with warmth rising from black soil, with the vow that refused to die. The chronicles end without conclusion, only echo, ashes breathing beneath birch roots, faith still sealed by fire. In the parish's final surviving ledger, one anonymous hand added a last sentence before the book itself was lost. Their prayer was flame, and flame remembers. The rest is silence, except perhaps on certain nights when wind passes through the ridge and carries with it a sound like distant chanting, the memory of Ravenswood Abbey, and the undying hum of faith that burned too brightly to ever truly fade.